Hello and welcome to another episode of Our Own Devices. And we are going to talk about the topic that is really on top of everybody's mind, and that is about artificial intelligence and generative AI. To talk about this time, and we've had a couple of discussions on this. This time we have David Barber, who is director of the UCL Centre for Artificial Intelligence and a distinguished scientist at UiPath. UiPath, for those who don't know, is a company that specializes in automation software. David, welcome to the show.
Thank you very much. Great to be here.
So, David, everybody's talking about AI and generative AI and ChatGPT. But for you, like as somebody who really understands the subject, how is this different from the AI that's been there for so long? AI is not really new, right? We have evolved on it for maybe a couple of decades. But how is what's happened since last November really new, and how is that going to change our lives?
Well, I think, like you say, AI isn't a new thing, but it's. I think the capabilities previously were nowhere near the level that we've had, say, for the last year or so. And I think that's largely to do with scale. And these developments, to be honest, I think were quite unanticipated, certainly by a lot of people, even within the AI community itself. So I think it has to people like myself, 2-3 years ago, whether or not just training these very large models would result in anything particularly different from what we had before, I probably would have said no. And I think a lot of other people might have said no as well. So I think there have been surprising, if you like, non-linear changes here. These sort of emergent intelligence that we see in these systems is actually quite surprising. And that's the scale. So previously, these systems were trained on relatively small amounts of data, but people have been audacious enough to train it on huge amounts of data. I mean, it's sort of internet scale amounts of data with huge amounts of compute resources. And you have actually quite surprising results. These systems seem to be much more capable than many people would have anticipated previously.
And the learning itself is taking a path or a trajectory that was not really predicted, right? Because it's learning at a better, faster scale every day, every hour, every minute. So it's also throwing up new things, right? Like how it is. So I was reading about the black box, for instance, where it's learning things which it has not been trained on, for instance. So is that, of course, there's a dark side to it, but this also means that we really don't know maybe 6 months down the line where we will be, right?
Yeah, that's right. I mean, these systems are highly complicated systems which are trained on, like I said, huge amounts of data. So I think, as you're suggesting as well, I wouldn't say that it necessarily learns something it hasn't been trained on, but it can infer things which are in the training data, which people perhaps not have explicitly written down. Yeah. So, that I think is like a smart person in some sense, right? You can tell them the basic information, and they can figure things out for themselves. Now, whether or not that's magic or not depends in some sense on the capabilities of that individual, right? And I think that's something that we are seeing in these kind of systems as well, that they do have that emergent, as people like to say, capabilities which were not anticipated. And who knows how it's going to progress. So some people are saying, well, how are we going to go from here? A lot of the training data which might be available to train these systems has already been used. So a good fraction of the internet has already been in some sense ingested into these systems. And where do we go next? Is it going to be needing other kinds of data actually, or other kinds of training? Maybe we need people to actually input different kinds of data to actually learn from people maybe more, rather than taking static information, say straight from the internet. Who knows? But it's certainly a very exciting, going to be a very exciting ride for the next few months and years.
As you mentioned, the input is a very important part of this entire process, right? Like, if you're using ChatGPT, for instance, it's as good as your prompts, right? If your prompts are dumb, it might give you an even dumber answer. But when we look at automation, is there a similar problem that we need to solve, that we really don't know what all it can automate, because maybe it's capable of a lot of things, but we have not been able to think of, okay, this is a problem it can solve for us?
Well, people are trying, I think, experimenting, a lot with that right now. So I think the hope is that these systems can do not just things like you're mentioning with say simple prompting for say things like GPT models, but maybe they can do clever things that can actually help us in our daily lives or even in our work lives, which actually I think are perhaps have been less explored. I mean, they're more complicated things because there are situations there in your workplace where you might need to be a little bit more careful about these things. Accuracy, reliability of these systems is, of course, sort of paramount importance. But I think the most of the excitement previously has been just in the consumer side of things, where people are using these systems in amazing ways. They're writing emails or creating sort of stories or whatever it might be. That's really cool. Or all kinds of creative applications that we haven't even thought about yet. But I think the hope is that there's a potential there, and certainly, we're very interested in that. I think others are as well, in how to use these systems to actually automate processes. Make our work lives more exciting, more interesting, less boring in some sense. Take some of the drudgery out of those daily tasks that none of us particularly enjoy, and actually free us up as humans to do the more interesting stuff, the more creative stuff, the things that humans are really good at, but machines are not particularly good at yet.
So this, like, I've heard many versions of this. They're taking the drudgery out, taking the mundane out. But is that also a cultural? How do I put it? This is maybe like in a country like India, where you still have lots of people who can be employed, maybe even in very boring, mundane things. Is that how, you? So can you have a blanket thinking on taking that drudgery out of work, where a lot of people still don't have work, and this could maybe make them or make more people unemployed? So how do you look at that? So does it need to have like a slightly customized thinking for a different market or a different culture, for instance?
Yeah, I mean, it's hard to say, right? I mean, there's a lot of discussion about the role of AI, and particularly generative AI now, in terms of the job market and what that's going to mean, not just in India, of course, but globally.
Yeah.
And it's hard to say what will happen. I think people are in the short to midterm future. I think largely we're going to see augmentation of these technologies to help people. So I wouldn't see them necessarily as whole scale necessarily removing jobs, but I think certainly they will be used to help people. Because if you think about some sectors like where the information is critical to get right, then would you really trust the machine? You still need humans in the loop to say, well, okay, that's that's okay, or that's not okay. And so the machine might help you to say generate a response, say, to a customer query, but whether or not that's actually something, the thing you really want to send, well, maybe you still need somebody to check that at the moment. In the longer term, it's again, it's hard to say, but technology always moves on leaps and bounds, and the world adapts, right? We hope that actually these technologies will mean that we will have more interesting jobs, which will may replace some of the current jobs which are around. But I think retrospectively, I hope most people will look back on that and say, well, that actually was a good thing, because people are actually more free to do the things that that I think the higher value things. And economies are increasing rapidly, and I think there's no going back from this, right? I think there's no way that we any economy can say, well, we can somehow ignore this and hope that it's not going to affect us. It will affect all of us, and I think we'll have a huge, I hope, ultimately positive impact on the job market, education, the role of governments as well in society, the openness to governments and information access across the board. I think will be really, really, really exciting, and people are great at finding ways to do things with their time, including in the job market.
An interesting aspect that you touched upon is how maybe you need more humans to check what the output you're getting from AI. And I was part of a recent discussion where we were talking about in the publishing industry, like if AI is going to write more content, you will actually have to invest in more editors to ensure that the content is up to standard, or fact checking. Now, is that also going to be a phase where when you would have maybe people clearing what AI has done, then AI itself is going to learn that, okay, that's the right way. So it's going to get better, right? Like, how do you see that going to happen, or is AI itself going to end up creating more jobs?
Yeah, that's a good point. I mean, the ability of the AI to learn itself, what the actual correct thing should have been, that generation, that email that it wrote in response to customer query is actually inappropriate. And there are companies out there, including our own, which actually are working on those systems. So yes, they will. That the human who then is overseeing that and says, well, actually, that generation wasn't so great, or that one was pretty okay. That information itself is used by the systems to update their, if you like, their surveillance capability to make sure that these generations are appropriate. So they will improve over time. Now, will that mean, again, a job market shift in terms of, well, where are the humans spending their time? Maybe there will be job opportunities. I don't know whether there'll be more of them, but yes, I would say that now, you won't be spending so much time writing this email, but maybe, yes, you'll be spending more time ensuring that the generation quality is correct. If, for example, it's in a space like customer query responses.
So all of us know that in everything that we do, there are certain parts which maybe AI can do better, but certainly it can do faster. And there is no, if it's better is still maybe out for debate. But even then, we still haven't figured out how to sort of bring everything into the flow, into the workflow, right? How do I do it without me initiating something and bringing in AI into the system? So is that a conversation that now across industries that's happening? Like, how do you integrate AI into the flow? Where do you integrate AI into the flow? And where do you maybe keep it out? Because maybe you might lose your USP by bringing in AI into something, especially in the journalism business, right? Would I pay to buy something that's maybe written by a computer when I can pay for something that's written by an expert in the field?
Yeah, well, I think on the journalism front, I actually was speaking to a journalist as well the other day, and he'd written in his own words the draft and the points of the article, but actually he used then a method to one of these GPT models to actually then make sure it was okay, rephrase it, and then he tweaked that as well. So I think that's a good example of currently where we're at, and I think we're likely to be at in the next few years. But I think your question about the broader workflow situation, I think if you think about industries more generally, it's very cool to have a technology like an OpenAI style generative model. But the question really is, how does that bring business to your company? So if you're an individual, yes, I could imagine that you could use these systems to accelerate, say, drafting of an email or something like that. But if you're thinking about other kinds of business processes, like, say, invoice processing or things which are really happening at a grand scale, then the question is, how do you take advantage of these automation capabilities such that you can actually scale it and use it with value within your company? So, that's, I think, really where there's a lot of excitement in terms of the business opportunities. Is there a way to, say, take these individual capabilities, like, say, being able to process, a document, so maybe it's a PDF or maybe even a scan, read it in some sense, for example, then do some intelligence behind the scenes, maybe do some database lookups, check whether or not this is a valid invoice number, and then respond to the customer query in an appropriate way. That's actually linking all of these things together in some kind of, platform, which I think is necessary when you think about a business process. I mean, business processes are not, they're not isolated objects which are, somehow not really function together. They all need to be integrated into a grander scheme of things, and one which actually also has reproducibility. It has to have some sense of accountability and responsibility all baked into that platform. So things like banks, for example, are understandably quite excited, but also a little bit nervous about the usage of these kinds of tools within their sectors. Yeah, it's great. Maybe you can save some time, writing an email to a customer, but if you get it wrong, or the information is not correctly extracted from a database, then that's probably, not worth the risk. So I think that's really where the conversations at a sort of more of an enterprise level certainly are based, which is, how do you integrate into some more, end-to-end platform, the individual capabilities, amazing capabilities these systems have, such that you get the business benefit that you'd like to have.
So as AI-driven automation sort of comes into different industries, do you also see a mass level upskilling, that needs to be done so that people understand how to work with these new technologies, how to exploit these new technologies to their best?
Yes. The good news, I think, there is that things have got so advanced now that upskilling, I think, should be relatively quick. You don't need to be particularly technically sophisticated to be able to use these systems. In some sense, we're still learning about them every day. There's new tricks which emerge, how to prompt them. Quite frankly, I mean, I thought this was kind of strange, when some people started to talk about, prompt engineering as a thing, a few, maybe a year or so ago, or certainly 6 months ago. And I thought it was some kind of joke, it's like, it's like but it's actually quite revealing that, this is the way that you can actually interface with these machines. And I think that's it's quite a natural thing for people to do. I think we've moved away from a very technical sense of needing to understand these things. I'm talking now about, of course, the implementation of the ability for the general consumer or the general office worker to actually use these systems. I think the level of technical knowledge required to access these capabilities is actually relatively low. So I think that's really exciting. Actually, I mean, that who'd have thought that we can essentially just talk to these machines in a very natural way and actually get the kind of responses that you would like. So, but things that may change. So we're still at very early days. I mean, I would like to just give we spoke a little bit that these things happened. I think GPT 3.5 or ChatGPT came out, I think late last year. So we're talking 6 months, 7, 8 months away. Not that long ago. And who knows what's around the corner? GPT-4 is here, but multimodality, the image, is not yet here. That's probably going to arrive later towards the end of this year. That may also have an amazing boost to the kinds of things and the conversational capabilities of these systems as well. So, you may be not just having now sort of textual-based conversations with these systems, but the next natural step, of course, would have been you will actually be able to maybe understand images and generate images as you're conversing with the system. And then, of course, there are additional things as well, that you can speak to it, and maybe videos, of course, down the line as well.
On the problems it can solve, where do you think generative AI is limited right now, and of course that's the opportunity that we should look forward for the future. I know crystal ball gazing in this space is very tough because it's changing so fast. But as of now, what are you most excited about? What do you see is really going to change what we already have?
Well, the one of the major things that people are, I think, struggling with there's a few. So one of them, of course, is the hallucinations issue, which means that essentially these systems generate responses which are essentially factually incorrect or not consistent with requirements in some way. So some people say that this has not been solved at all, and this is a very challenging thing to address because we don't really understand these systems extremely well. They're not black boxes, but the level that you can guarantee that they are not going to do bad things is limited. But there are ways around that. So, for example, if you're thinking about knowledge management, and let's say you're a government agency, and you've got customers who are or people in the population who are citizens just asking for advice or information, then actually you could use that more as a search, an enhanced search capability, where they say, well, okay, this person's asking for this particular piece of information, and buried in some government documents, there's some archaically written legislation about this thing. And because you could point the user, say, well, look, this is the legislation. You can read it. We think this is the appropriate thing. This is our interpretation of it. Star that this is actually it could be incorrect, but you could actually use those kinds of systems to help people, and they will improve over time as well. But to get access to the information that they would like. So I think hallucinations is certainly one of the major challenges right now. People are working actively to try to address that. I think another major thing is just it's a related issue, which is that these systems are trained not necessarily on your data, right? So if you're a company that has private documents, the system won't have seen them, right? It's basically trained on public data sets largely.
Yeah.
So how are you going to then say, maybe you're a legal company and you've got hundreds of thousands of documents and you want to do some interesting research with that, find similar cases of whatever it might be, or how can you ingest all of those documents in some sense into this large language model, for example? So there's a couple of ways of doing that. Now, currently, it's done with a lot of prompt engineering, which is quite clunky because the memory of these systems is quite limited. The amount of these like working memory is only maybe a few thousand characters, and people are going to think about bumping that up to 100,000. Anthropic's got a new model, Claude, which I think can do 100,000. OpenAI are talking about 1 million at some point, but that's still nowhere near the level of, say, a whole company's worth of information. So that's I think a very interesting challenge. So how to do that? Whether or not there's then maybe you need to retrain these systems, fine tune them on your own private data sets. Does that guarantee that they will have correctly ingested all the information in your own company, in your own private data, to the extent they'll never make a mistake? We don't know. That's still, I think, a very open challenge, and fact checking, making sure that the information is never going to be incorrectly represented. So I think those are two kind of connected, interesting challenges.
So, David, what are the new trends in automation, especially because you have so much happening in the AI space?
So one thing which is very cool, I think, is the idea, well, first of all, to have a platform, which I think is a very important aspect of automation. I think we mentioned another point that actually these individual capabilities themselves are not going to be particularly useful for business if they're not integrated into an overall structure which actually has business value itself. But I think there are very interesting things where we can see, so for example, if you can copy and paste information from one place to another is a very useful thing. So there's a new thing that we have called Clipboard AI, which is quite cool. So for example, you might have a document, for example, an invoice, and you might have a spreadsheet. And wouldn't it be great if you could just say, well, I could say copy the information and the invoice and paste it into the spreadsheet, and by magic, it would just somehow fill in the name of the supplier, the amount on the invoice, the dates, etc., on the spreadsheet automatically. That's a very cool feature. So that's something that I think people would, I hope, would find quite exciting. Of course, that's not so easy to do. There's a lot of cool technology behind the scenes there. I think another very interesting thing that we're starting to see is people using these AI systems actually to more rapidly create automated processes. So historically, it's quite challenging and complex to create a process through RPA, robotic process automation, to actually go through all the stages, exactly how this works. So wouldn't it be great as well if you had a kind of a system which could sit there with you, a kind of co-pilot, if you like, for RPA, to actually help you more rapidly develop these processes? And that's also something that we're working very heavily on right now, which I think is very, very, very cool. I think more generally, if you think about a year or two, maybe even less down the line, things that we are very excited about are more general capabilities for interacting with machines. So, can you get machines to actually read screens in a seamless way, interact with them, carry out in a very reliable sense processes? And that's something that we're very excited to work on, and I'm hoping that you'll see quite soon huge steps forward, particularly from companies like ours in that space. So, you might then be able to just go to a computer and say, well, can you, for example, carry out this task for me? And you write that in very natural sounding language, and it actually just does it for you. And that would be very, very cool. Another thing which is actually also happening is the idea of, well, can I show the computer what I mean? So maybe I can demonstrate and one or two examples. Well, this is what I mean to fill out this expense claims form, for example.
And then you automate it from there.
Yeah, and it may be something the machine's never seen before. It could be a brand new piece of software that has not been trained on. So it's a little bit of an ask to say, well, surely you should be able to do that, off the bat. But if you can do that with a couple of demonstrations, I think that would also be very cool. So we're also we're working on these kinds of things as well. So I think there's a lot of exciting things going to be coming around the corner.
Interesting, very interesting. As we come to the end of the podcast, one last question. How do you think like country like India, which has very different challenges from maybe Europe or in America, how does a country like India sort of use this to its benefit? Because again, the big fear in a country like India is that, okay, it's going to impact jobs where we are still struggling, to give enough jobs to our billion plus people. So how do you think it can be useful for a country like India? And you have many other countries where, it's maybe still too early to sort of, unleash it.
Well, I think, India is a very complex, large country, with a lot of, for example, different languages, different cultures. And I think going back to the example I was talking about before, when you think about information and knowledge management, so a lot of countries are struggling with this, right? Getting, I think increasingly all of our societies develop, I think the role of citizens is becoming, we feel like we shouldn't have to wait, just for somebody on the phone to answer an inquiry. This is really kind of, it's not good, right? So I think there's an amazing opportunity for places like India with that diversity to actually, offer citizens through any language you like to get access to, for example, local or central government information or tax advice, or these are things which I think are very empowering for people. First of all, I think in a citizen sense, economically, India is in a great position, I think, because maybe you're not so wedded to you're still developing and have opportunities to change rapidly and quickly and adapt to these capabilities, and you've got a huge and highly educated upcoming workforce, which I think is very, very exciting for a place like India. I think there are amazing opportunities here to make a new generation of people who are actually highly skilled at this. But one thing I would also stress, I think it's very important that India doesn't become too overly reliant on these individual technologies. It should also be developing its own technologies. I think that's also very important to make sure that everybody in the world does get, I think, fair and interesting access to these capabilities. I don't think we should necessarily expect that we should have only a few providers globally of these kinds of systems. And I think it's important that everybody starts to generate an understanding of how these systems work, that there are people within their countries and cultures that actually also have the capability to train these kinds of systems.
Interestingly, Sam Altman was here just last week and sort of challenged the country to come up with with something of the scale of ChatGPT. And I've heard that a lot of Indian companies are sort of taking up the challenge, and that could throw up a completely different way of doing things, right?
Yeah, absolutely. I think that's really important. You hear a lot of negativity around the chance to, say, compete with these large tech giants who've already been spending a lot of money, a lot of time on this. But we've also seen a lot of progress in open source. It's catching up very quickly, and it's maybe not yet quite at the performance level of some of these large providers, but it's not far off, and it's actually quite surprising, that you can, with a relatively small team, still, some significant investment behind there in computer resources, but you can do quite well. And certainly we're seeing, I think companies like private organizations like Luther AI are very good in this space, and others as well. And I think within, a few months, you probably see something like the capabilities of certainly ChatGPT replicated by these systems. So of course, maybe the large labs will still always be a few months in front, but I think it's not going to be that far away from having open source. And maybe the world will demand that. Maybe people say, well, look, these systems have been built in some sense on the backs of the output of humanity. Therefore, it's only right and fair that humanity itself, it doesn't have to necessarily pay too much to get access to them. It should be something that would be considered maybe a right. In some sense, they're only sort of ingesting and regurgitating in a very smart way the outputs of entire human history, the recorded human history. So I think there will be great public pressure to anyway support things like open source projects. And I think therefore, the future is very bright for this, but we have to tread in a way so that that future is bright in the sense that we keep things real in terms of the regulation, that the responsibility is there, that these systems are not overly abused, but we nevertheless remain optimistic about the future.
Interestingly, even though we call it artificial intelligence, maybe it's in a way our collective intelligence which is at play here as humanity, as you said.
Yeah.
So thanks for being on the show. You were listening to David Barber, and absolutely wonderful, getting a slightly philosophical, a forward-looking view on what's happening, and a very positive view on what's happening in the space of AI, which is always evolving. Thank you. You're listening to Our Own Devices with Nandagopal Rajan. We'll be back again with more guests. And till then, we are available everywhere you listen to our podcast.